Hello, Dr. Mack. This is my video blog response to the question of was Dr. Martin Luther King a black theologian, at least according to the Reverend Dr. Senator Warnock. So in his introduction to this book, Reverend Dr. Senator Warnock is pretty cleared in his statement that he doesn't see black theology as solely an academic discipline. That he sees it as having stemmed out of the black church and out of the lived religious experiences of black people, with the academic discipline serving to interpret that theology and theological work that already existed within a black religious context. Which I think is just pertinent to hold on to when we're thinking about what black theology is per his definitions. And he also situates black theology as kind of one aspect of a broader kind of work that he calls black religious resistance. And it's within that he, frames his 4 moments of black religious resistance, his 4 moments that contribute to black liberation theology and black theology overall. So on page 48 of, I'm blanking on the title of our book, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, he basically makes the argument that he doesn't say that Dr. Martin Luther King is not a black theologian. He says it's problematic to call him one. Specifically because he feels that including Dr. King in the scope of black theology undermines the importance of the moment in which black theology emerges. That black theology, in his mind, is very much in conversation with and in response to the Black Power movement, which was really just starting to get its legs underneath it by the time Dr. King was assassinated. So including Dr. King in the canon of black theologians implies that the Black Power movement was not as formative as it really was for the discipline of black theology. So he doesn't offer a hard no to the question that he poses of whether or not Dr. King is a black theologian, but he raises issue with it. And, for my own thinking, I agree with him. I think it's important to understand that, when we're talking about theologians in general, and this is way outside the scope of, just Dr. King and black theology, when we are talking about theologians throughout history, we don't refer to them exclusively by the content of their work. We also refer to them based on the moment in which they were preaching, reading, writing, thinking. When we talk about Reformation theologians, we're not talking about a specific kind of idea so much as we're talking about a particular moment in church history and the responses to that moment in church history. So I guess I think that Warnock's answer to this question is valid. I agree that it is problematic to include Dr. King in the canon of black theological thinkers. I also think that this is a question that has multiple valid answers. And I also feel compelled to point out that it's also a little problematic to not include Dr. King in the list of black theologians. For a couple of reasons, mostly having to do with arguments that Warnock himself already made in this book. So to begin with, again, in the introduction, he argues that black theology as not an academic discipline, but black theology as a religious praxis really predates the academic discipline. Here he argues that The academic discipline is responding to a theology which had already begun to be formed in the Black church within Black religious life. And I think if we're going to take that premise seriously, then we do need to include in the canon of Black theology thinkers and ideas that predate, like, say, the publication of Black Theology and Black Power in 1969. And he frames the defining moment of Black theology as being in response to the Black Power movement, which, similarly, it existed before it formalized and became more stable in itself. The ideas and thinkers that caused, what we think of as the Black Power movement did not spring spontaneously into being in 1969. They existed beforehand, and the more formalized, structured movement that we refer back to in history now is a continuation to and response to ideas that already existed. So that's why I'm a little hesitant to uncritically accept his position that Dr. King belongs to a different moment than Black theology, purely because I think it's difficult to harshly, rigidly define where a moment begins and ends, especially when you say moment, you mean a mass movement of hundreds of thousands of people following particular religious trends that emerge within their own churches and communities. I think it's really hard to pin down a beginning and end. So I'm hesitant of the premise that King can be solidly sorted outside of that moment, outside of the Black theology bracket. And I also think it's important to remember that, if anyone is a Black theologian, it would be Dr. James Cone, who founded that discipline. And as I was reading, these segments of Dr. King's work in this piece, I can see the echoes, or I can see the prefixes to ideas that, Dr. Cone writes about later. So, for example, on page 42 of The Divided Mind of the Black Church, there is an excerpt from one of Dr. King's writings, where he says, "Unearned suffering is redemptive. There are some who still find the cross a stumbling block, and others consider it foolishness, but I am more convinced than ever that it is the power of God unto social and individual salvation." So, like the Apostle Paul, "More than ever, I am convinced of the reality of a personal God." Oh, I don't think that's the actual quote I wanted. Point being, Dr. King looks at the cross and argues that because God, in the form of Christ, was willing to die on the cross, for social and individual salvation, then his followers ought to be willing to do the same. And by his followers, I actually mean both God's followers and Christ's followers and Dr. King's followers. That he basically argues that Christ's death on the cross is a model through which, suffering can be made redemptive, a model which can be followed by Black people who choose to fight for liberation, knowing that there's a strong chance it's going to get them killed. So you can see the connection between Christ suffering on the cross and Black people suffering under the American Empire, and the martyrdom of Christ and the martyrdom of civil rights leaders like Dr. King himself, which is hard to ignore as a precursor to Cone's work in The Cross and the Lynching Tree. So I think it's difficult to argue that Dr. King does not belong within the canon of Black theology, given that his ideas are very much present within it, and that these ideas were his being contributed to the field of Black theology in a contemporary way. Like, Dr. Cone was a student of theology studying and, honing what would become the academic field of Black theology when Dr. King was preaching these words. So I guess I think this is a question with multiple valid answers, and I think Warnock offers one by saying that no, Dr. King doesn't exactly belong to the moment of Black theology because he came too early for that. And I think you can also argue the opposite and say, yes, he does belong to Black theology because, he is one of its earlier forefathers. He is a proto-Black theologian that contributed a lot to the formation of the field, even though he didn't live to see it come to its full fruition. Yeah, and in terms of whether Reverend Dr. Senator Warnock himself is a Black theologian, I think this is a similar question that has multiple valid answers. Because when I'm reading this piece, I see him interacting with Black theology on sort of a meta level and trying to map out the parameters of it and consider how Black theology as a field interacts with the liberative work of the Black church, and also how the Black church needs to function to achieve the goals of liberation theology in a realistic way in society. So in that sense, I think he's definitely a Black theologian because he is doing the work of, using Black religion and Black people's relationship with God to fight for their liberation in this life. And you can also, I think, argue that he is not doing Black theology right now. He is studying Black theology from a remove. He's looking at it on a meta level. He's doing something almost like sociology, actually, by examining how this movement interacts with other related ones in history and what that means for where we ought to go next. I'm comfortably over time. Sorry about that. I think I've said everything I needed to say, and I've really enjoyed this reading, and I look forward to doing more about it. Thank you very much.